Okay, hello everybody. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to get this final video out to you. I get swamped starting in about April and it goes through pretty much November. So today I thought I have to get this done. So we're going to go through finishing your Northern Flora quilt. Okay, so I'm going to just go through the steps with you. Some of you may have been like, I'm not waiting for her. I've done this already. And you can always just go through the book and follow the steps, but I'm just going to kind of walk you through some of them. I have my poor beat up book. My cover has fallen off. And I have one of my books that had a printing error. So you'll notice my first page here is a little light. I can still see it. Works perfectly fine. And when I run out of my great books, I'll probably have to sell these ones because people still want to do this BOM every year, which is great. So anyhow, first step we're going to do, we've already done all the beginning here, doing all of our appliques, right? So we're actually going to jump down here to step 7 and cutting your light blue. So we're cutting our setting triangles here in our corners and our first inner border, which is the border that makes this whole thing kind of float. So I have already cut a few of them. Now here's our first, well, wait. First one on the list actually is the 7 7/8 strip that we're cutting 2 7 7/8 squares. Now these first squares are going to actually be our corners. So once you get your squares cut, you're going to cut these ones on the diagonal. So all I do is I just line it up on my board. You can follow one of these 90-degree diagonal lines, but I just usually line up my corners, make sure I'm on my points, and cut through the middle. There you go. So now your bias edge is this straight edge, and we're going to support that with our appliques here in a minute. But these corners, this is going to be that bias edge. That way our right angle edges are going to stay nice and in place with our grains of our fabric because they're not cut on the bias. So we're going to support the bias on those corners. Now our big triangle here, the next step is our 2 15 1/4 inch strips that we're going to get 3 15 1/4 inch triangles out of. These ones we're going to cut an X through the middle, and we're going to end up with, from each triangle, 4 of these. So here's my one I already cut. And now these ones, we have our right angle, put it back together, cut, cut. So now our right angles are our bias edge, and we're going to support those edges so we don't have stretching with our cathedral window appliques, and that's all these ones around here. Now, you're doing 3 squares, and so when you cut them, you'll get 4 triangles out of each square. We actually only need 10 to go around the entire quilt. So 2 of your triangles will be discarded. So just so you know that. So now that we have those and we've cut our strips for our outer border, and we're sewing those strips together, and we're going to get 2 2-inch by 59.5 inch and 2 2-inch by 42.5 inch pieces for that first inner border also. Okay, so now we've got our light blue cut. The next one we're going to do is we're going to cut on step 8 for our second border, which is, in the case of this coloration of the quilt, this dark blue blueberry fabric. And here's our blueberry fabric. I don't have one of my kits with me, so I'm just make sure you know which one that is. And that one we're going to go ahead and we're going to cut 6 2-inch strips again. We're sewing those together, and we're getting 2 2-inch by 45.5 inch. Oh, that's for the bottom, and 2 2-inch by 62.5 inch for our sides. And just kind of hang those out, those strips to the side for a moment while we get the other stuff going. On to step 9. Arrange cathedral window appliques onto your setting triangles as shown below. Use the same print for both edges of each side setting triangle. Use 2 print colors for the 4 corners, 2 of each corner setting. So what I'm saying there is for each of these 10 that we have, what I'm going to do is when I cut, so you know all those scraps you had left over from your cathedral windows for all these blocks? That's where we're going to get those setting triangles, or setting, I'm sorry, we're going to get our cathedral window appliques for our setting triangles from. So all those scraps that I said, reserve those scraps, you're going to cut in sets of 2 a whole bunch of different triangles for these. So we actually need, let's see, we need 12 sets. So 24 individual strips or individual appliques, sorry. My brain today has been having the wrong words come out of my mouth, so I hope I don't confuse everybody. So we want 12 sets, 24 singles, right? Now for our corners, this is our corners. For our corners, what I've done is I just have used like this one here, this dark. I'm using the other for the opposite corner. And like here with the brown butterfly one, this one, I have the single here and I have the opposite single up here. But for our setting ones on the sides and on the bottom and top here, I'm using the same two colors for that triangle. And the reason that I did that was to make it kind of appear like it would be another block coming off. And these ones, you know, are a set of 4. This would be 2. If you saw the other side, you'd see the other 2. But if you don't want to have yours be the same color, you can always do something different. You can make this one black and this one this way. You can do, you know, whatever you want. It's not really necessary that they have to match, but that's how I did it in the thing. So when we go to put them on here, we'll just do that really quick on this one. So for our side setting triangles, we're going to do 10 of these. And we're going to go ahead and take our cathedral window appliques, and I'm lining up the point like we did on all of our flowers with this right angle point, and then laying it down just like right along the edge. And you'll notice that there is a little bit of a gap, and there's sort of, I mentioned it in the book here, a 1/4 inch gap right here at the end. That's fine because that's going to go away in your seam allowance. So just making sure where you want to fit these in is with this right angle. And right now what I'm also doing when I put these down is I'm actually also supporting that bias edge. So now our bias edge has this seam and this fabric that I'm going to now fuse on, and that's going to support the edge. Okay, so now with our corner triangles, this is our bias edge, and we don't want anything to stretch. So again, we're going to support that edge with our applique. And I'm just going to center it on here. And you're again going to have a little bit of a gap on either side. And you want that. Eva, are you paying attention? Okay. I have my videographer and my videographer's assistant here today. So now at this point, we would want to do this for 10 of these, all 4 of these, and then we're going to fuse everything just like we've done before. Go through and just permanently fuse them all in place. And then you've got all your setting triangles ready. Okay, so next step, arranging the quilt center. Okay, so arranging completed quilt blocks as shown on page 5. So here's our page 5. Here's how we're going to do it. So we're going to do it in strips essentially. So looking at the quilt here itself, strip A is just that top triangle. That's all it is. So once you got your triangle ready, you're good. Strip B is going to be this setting triangle, your forget-me-not block, and the other setting triangle. Now when you go to do your sewing, I do want to give you a little example here of how you're going to sew these setting triangles, because so here's what, let's say this is our forget-me-not block and I need to sew this setting triangle. Let me go. Okay, like this. So when you go to sew your setting triangles together, and Eva, will you watch what I'm doing right here with my hands? We want to line up this straight edge and these right angles when we go to do our sewing. So I'm going to sew, if I'm going to sew this edge, I'm going to line these corners up just like it was a regular square on a square. And you'll notice that there is an overhang here on this point. You want that overhang because when you bring your 1/4 inch seams in, it's going to come way over here to the 1/4, and you're going to have this extra tip that's longer than your normal 1/4 inch over on a right angle. So when you're lining these up, I just want to make sure that you understand that you want to line up your right angles together. Don't like line up this point here with the point of that corner, because you're going to have it hanging over 1/4 inch over here, right? So line up your right angles, and you're going to end up with that triangle sticking out the side. And that is what you want. You actually want that. And then you do your 1/4 inch seam and you open it up, and you'll do that on all your others. Now, if you have your corners, let's say this is a corner. When you're going to do your corners, you actually want to center this point through the center of your quilt. Now you can go ahead and you can mark the center if you want, but I usually just eyeball it. And I want my points hanging off at about equal distance. So you'll see here, and maybe if I flip it over, you can kind of see too, how the points are sticking out about equally. That's fine, like to just do it like that. And that's often what I just do is eyeball it. But essentially it's, again, you're going to do your 1/4 inch seam, and that's going to get rid of those little points sticking out. So, okay, hopefully that makes sense to everybody. So we're going to sew our strips together. So we've done strip A, strip B, strip C, strip D, and then we come down here. This little corner is E, F, G, and H. So how I like to sew big quilts together when I'm doing the centers is I like to do half and half, and then sew the 2 big halves together at the end. That's why we have us go to D and then go down here to E and back up to G, or to H, sorry. So we're sewing A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and then we sew A to B, B to C, C to D, E to F, F to G, G to H, and then our final stitch will be through the center here. Ooh, combining those 2 halves, and we now have a finished quilt center. As you're doing these seams, you also want to press your seams open. So if you see the back of my quilt here, you'll see that all of these center ones are pressed open. And the reason I'm doing that is because each one of these seams has a cathedral window applique fabric, a layer of steam seam, and your background layer. So if I were to press all this seam to one side, I actually now have 3 layers in that 1/4 inch seam, right? I have my original layer, I have my layer of the seam allowance for that first one, and I have the seam allowance layer for the one next to it. So I would end up with, essentially there's 3 layers to each and times 3. So I would have 3 times 3. So I would have 9 layers in a seam all pressed one way right there. If I open my seam up, I only double the layers, so where I have 6 layers on each side of that seam. And that will give you a much flatter seam through there, and especially when you go to quilt it, it will give you a much nicer area to stitch through. I mean, you imagine stitching through 9 layers of material versus just stitching through those 6, which is actually 4 layers of fabric, 2 layers of steam seam in there. But for quilting, and even as I feel it here, it's so much more flat than if I were to have one big bulky layer of seam allowance. So anyhow, that's why I say press seams open. Usually if I ask you to press seams open in any of my designs, there's a reason for it, and it's always to do with reducing bulk. Okay, so making the outer borders. So let's get this stuff out of the way. We'll move on to your outer border. So you're going to take all those outer border strips. I give you 5.5 inches, and we actually only need 3.5 inches. So I usually give extra so that if you want to wash them, you have some extra for your warping and shrinking. So you want to cut 12 3.5 inch batik strips. Now I will remind you that in your kit, you don't have 12 different ones, you have 11, but you have an extra thick one, extra big piece of this blueberry, this green blueberry one. So you're actually taking 2 strips of the blueberry and then 1 strip of the other 11. So you will have 12 strips total. 11 different fabrics, doubling up on the blueberry to give you that extra 12th strip. And then you're just going to sew them together in any random order. So here is one that we've sewn together. I've already cut some of the strips off, but you can see I just sort of randomly put them in here, and here's this blueberry in here twice, and all the others that you get in your kit, just a 3.5 inch strip, and we've sewn them all together in a random order, and that gives us this big long, this big long 45 length strip by a finished now 3 inch piece, right? So now we're going to subcut this into our sections for the outer border. So I'm going to go ahead, and I've already cut some of them off. We're going to want to cut, oh, let me see. Eva! Pick it up and get it back at me. Okay. Press seams to one side. So we want to cut them into 7. Oh, here, I read right here. Remember, step 13. Subcut into 7 5.5-inch strip combinations. So I've already cut 6 of them. And now I just need to cut my 7th one. So I'll go ahead and I'll do that. Line me up. So you're going to have your big long strip, and you're going to want to cut and measure twice, cut once, right? Because you don't want to mess up. You do have a little extra, but you don't have a whole lot extra. You don't have enough for an 8th strip. So you're going to cut a 5.5-inch strip. You do that 7 times. Here's my 7 strips that I've cut. That's for my borders. And here's my little extra, my little waist. Okay. So now that you have your 7 strips, you're going to want to separate one of these 5.5-inch strips into 3 4-block sections. So I've done some magic ahead of time and already did my seam ripping. So now you have one of them in 3 4-inch sections. So now the reason for that is because we're going to pick our favorites. So whichever ones you like the most. Like for me, this one's really nice and soft. This one's really nice and soft. This one has a couple darker colors in it. I don't want the dark, so I'm gonna get rid of that one. That's a waste one. So I've got these 2 sections left over. So to make your top and bottom strips, this one here and the one on top, what you need is 1 full strip and 1 of these 4-inch sections. And you can sew it on this side. You can sew it on this side. However you want, or wherever you want to sew them is fine. So I would sew this one onto here, and then when I open this up, it's going to give me a strip that has my original 12 plus 4 more. So I have 16 pieces to this strip, and that's how many you need to make it across the bottom. And then you do the same thing with this other one with your second strip. Pick whichever side you want to put it on. Open it back up. And then sew that one on there. And now you have your top strip. Okay, so that's our top and bottoms. And now our sides are super simple. We get left with 4 full strips, and we need 2 strips for each side. So I'm just going to take 2 of these strips, and I'm going to sew them together end to end. Now, because they're going to be this, like they're the same, I want to flip them around and like sew this end to this end so I don't end up with these 2 brown fireweeds next to each other. And then what I did, because the strips will be the same, is I did on one side, actually no, I didn't do this one. I didn't sew this one together, but it doesn't actually matter. What I did in my original was I made the strip, if it started with this fireweed and this lupin and this one going up this way, then what I did is on the other one, I flipped it. And that was on my original. I didn't sew this one together, but they're actually the same. If you look at this one, it starts the same, repeats, it's the same on that side. If I were doing it myself, I would have flipped those around, but you don't have to. And I didn't even notice it till just now, and I've looked at this quilt a number of times in the last few years. So that's it for your outer borders. So that gives you everything you need now to get your outer borders done. Okay, so now that we have everything cut and assembled, sewn together, we actually, let's see, I've got that done. So I'm flipping over to the next page. So we can actually start sewing borders on at this point. We've got our center sewn. Now we're going to start sewing our borders on. So first we're going to sew on our first inner border and our second inner border. We're going to do our top and bottom first, and then our sides for each respectfully, and then press your seams out. That you could press your seams in, I suppose, if you want, but in the first border, I would definitely press them out because you have those, the bulk from the center. So I just like to press, I just press them both out. Now you're going to sew your outer borders on. So we do our bottom again and top first, and then our sides. After you've sewn those on, I do recommend, you don't have to, but I do recommend to go around and sew a little seam on 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way around your outer border. The reason that I do this is because you're going to put all your appliques on next, so you're going to be moving the quilt around quite a bit, and you may decide you want to do some decorative stitching before you do quilting, and all that movement and all that interaction with the quilt will make some of these little seams that you've cut now start to unravel a bit. If you go ahead and you do that little 1/8 inch seam all the way around, that will secure those cut edges, and that will keep your borders from starting to unravel before you get to your quilter. So it's just something, you don't have to do it, but I very much recommend it at this point, especially on this quilt. So now that we've got all our entire center done, the last thing that we haven't done is put our appliques in place. Now, of course I have on this one, but you haven't. So doing your branch appliques, we've already done these steps. We did it already, right? We already put them all together, and we're all the way down to step 20 now. Arranging all branches around the outside of the quilt center and in your setting triangles. So the reason we don't arrange them up till this point is because you're actually going to have a lot of them going over that seam there. And I like to also see where the inner border, the second inner border is, so that I can make sure that I kind of center it around that triangle area and in the corners. You can use, if you want to, you can always use your little guides here. Put this, and you'll see this is for a corner one. So here's your, your a side one. So if you wanted to get your light table out, tuck that underneath, line up your cathedral window edges in there, be something like that, and then put your applique on according to that, you certainly can. I have those little edges. Here's the aspen, which is up here. You can put that underneath your light table, line it up, stick your aspen in place. But when I've done it, most of the time what I do is I just kind of eyeball it. And you can look at the picture on the front of the quilt, on your kit, whatever you want, or just kind of, like I said, eyeball it yourself. I kind of cover up the seam on these ones. I sort of lay them sort of over, like the spruce is right above the seam here. These little ones in the corner, I actually put the little branches basically on the seam. They go over a little bit, but the cedar and the birch, or I mean spruce in particular, are almost like covering up that seam of that first border. But mostly what you want is you want it to look good for you, right? So as long as you like where it is, you're good to go. And once you've got those in place, you want to fuse them really well. Make sure that they are stuck on there really good at this point. And then, let me find where we were in my instructions here. And then we are essentially done. So now it comes to quilting and any sort of finishing, binding, and that sort of stuff. Now your binding in your quilt is going to be this one. I don't have my binding on yet, so it'll look like that when it's done. Eventually I'll get this one finished. If you want to do any sort of decorative stitching before you do quilting, this is the time when you would want to do that. Make sure you're using a stabilizer behind it, and you can do anything you want. I mean, it's your quilt, you do what you want. A lot of people out there don't trust steam-a-seam to stay in place, and if you're worried about steam-a-seam staying in place, you can certainly go and you can stitch on any of these at this point and secure them better. I will let you know that if you are going to stitch on your appliques, please use a matching colored thread to do it. If you use clear in the lighter colors, because you're puncturing through the fabric and the steam-a-seam in particular will make that, will kind of leave that needle hole. And if you're using a clear thread, the only thing to fill it is clear, and it will look like little black dots all over your lighter colored fabrics. If you're doing a clear over like a darker color like this purple, you won't really notice that because it's dark. But if you're doing a clear thread and you're stitching onto your appliques on like this daisy, it will just look like little black dots all over it. So if you do want to do any stitching on your appliques, this is a good time to do it, but use a matching colored thread when you do that. For myself, I don't do that. I generally don't stitch on my appliques, and I'm going to give you a little example here of a different design. This is one of my quilts, and we'll just look at this one really quickly. The way that I did my quilt and the way that I do this one, and you can actually zoom in a little bit here, Eva, get close. You can see that I use, and maybe you can see it, it's hard to see. I use clear thread, and what I've done here is I'm just going around within about 1/8 of an inch of my applique without actually stitching on the applique. And I'll flip over the back so you can see that a little bit here. See how I've just stitched around the bear. And I'm just using a clear thread. And I do a stitch in the ditch around my borders too. But that's about all I do. And the reason for that is because I don't really like to quilt very much. So I don't extend that time, and I don't add a lot extra with my quilting. But there are a lot of people out there that really do beautiful things with quilting. And so, you know, do whatever you want. It's your quilt. So, but for me, when I did my quilt, when I finished my original ones, the way that I did it is I used a clear thread and I stitch on this light background, and I would just go around. I'd maybe start in a corner point, and I go within 1/8 of an inch all around on the background back to the point. Go to another point, go up here, go in, and just stay off the applique, but on the background going all the way around in the other section. And I did that to all of them. Now I did that when I had my background and my batting in there too. So that was my final quilting for everything. If you're doing decorative quilting, you can do it now without your batting and stuff. But if you are going to do like I did, that was my stitching my layers together quilting. So also, if you don't want to do any quilting at all, you can of course pay for custom quilting to do something like I did. But I also saw some ladies who did a block of the month a few years ago, and I got to see their quilts done with an all over design. And I was really impressed with it. I actually wasn't sure if I would like it because I knew, you know, there'd be stitching on the appliques, but they use a variegated thread, which I would suggest finding something that has some colors that match the quilt, like purples and greens and pinks and blues. And then they just did a tighter kind of stitch pattern that hit everything pretty well. And as I looked at it, I thought, you know, I mean, there might be a little thing here and there that it missed, but in general, the stitching really did cover the quilt really well and hit most appliques. So if you're worried about things falling off, just doing a tighter weave quilt by an all over type design by a local quilter would be a great option as well. And so that's basically it for getting the quilting done. Now, when you are using your quilt, if you ever feel that you need to wash it, I will say put it in a delicate cycle and then hang dry, because when you throw it into the dryer, what's it going to do? It's going to take a wet material and it's going to apply heat to it, which is essentially going to steam it. And when you steam a seam, you can actually loosen that up. And some of those things will actually come off in the drying cycle because you're re-steaming your glue. So hang dry, and then if you need to afterwards, you can iron it for sure. If you have any pieces that start to come off and there is some glue still on it, you can always try to re-steam. If it's not working, if maybe the glue got overheated in the first place, or if the glue got washed off or whatever damaged it or removed it, you can also take any sort of fabric glue. I like ones that will dry clear, and put it behind the applique and then press it back in place and let it dry. And then that will hold the applique back in place really well too. I've even taken little pieces of steam a seam and stuck them on the back, as long as they're not hanging out on the side, you know, trimmed it down, and then put a new piece of steam a seam behind little things too, if you ever need to do that. If you are putting the glue, I recommend a little toothpick, putting the glue on a toothpick and just like rubbing it behind the applique and then gently pressing the applique in place too. So I think that's about it. I also, of course, you're going to want to put your binding on once you get your quilt back. And if you need any tips for binding, if you want to see some more close-ups on how I do my quilting most of the time, you can go on my website. I have a tips page, and I have all sorts of pictures and instructions step-by-step on how I do binding and quilting. And yeah, I think we're done. And so awesome job, guys, and I hope that you all enjoy doing this quilt. I hope that when you're finished that you're proud of yourself. It's quite a big project, and even if it's like 6 years down the road that you're finally watching this one, good job, because I have quilts that are, I made a quilt for my daughter who's videoing and is turning 14. I started it when she was not even a year old, and it's still not finished. So we all have projects like that. So if it's 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, and these videos are still up and you're finally finishing, good job. So anyhow, I have lots of other tutorials on my other designs on my Facebook page. I'm trying to convince my daughter to help me set up a YouTube where I can maybe post them up there. So maybe that's up by now too. But anyhow, hope to see you all again. I hope you'll do other designs of mine, and I hope you enjoyed the Northern Flora quilt. And so have a great summer, and I hope to see you all again soon.